Nous allons justement maintenant nous demander comment ça se passe à l'international. Nous allons nous concentrer sur 4 pays clés pour que la notion de transition énergétique ne veut pas du tout dire la même chose et qui ont choisi des options, vous allez voir, très différentes. Les 2 plus gros consommateurs mondiaux d'énergie, la Chine et les États-Unis. L'Allemagne, si souvent présentée comme un modèle en la matière, et puis le Royaume-Uni, qui au cœur de l'Europe, comme si souvent, a fait des choix bien spécifiques. Je vous demande donc d'accueillir nos 4 intervenants. J'ai nommé Deborah Gordon, Andreas Löschel, Jim Skea et Wang. Merci de les applaudir, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being with us. So we'll do half of this, most of this in English. In fact, let me just introduce you first of all from the US. We're delighted to have with us Deborah Gordon. You're the Senior Associate Energy and Climate Program, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is one of the most renowned and influential analysts and commentators on the environmental questions in the US. From Germany, hello, guten Tag. We have Andreas Löschel. You are a professor of economics at the University of Heidelberg, and you're also the chairman of the experts commission named by the government to monitor the German Energiewende, the energy transition. So you'll be able to give us, I think, quite exclusive insights from the inside as a government advisor. From the UK, we have, I'm not sure how to, I'm British, but I don't know how to pronounce your name, Skea. Skea, right, yes, okay. You're one of the UK's top energy researchers, Professor of Sustainable Energy at Imperial College, and you'll also be able to give us the insights that you have since the 2012 Strategy Fellow for the Research Council's UK Energy Program. And from China, I think you say ni hao, Wang, you run China's Climate and Energy Policy Program of the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy at Tsinghua University. You were previously the program manager of the NGO WWF China, so you're going to bring us quite an unbiased, I hope, vision of the question. Right, let's get on with it. A simple but essential question to you all to start with about energy transition. We say Energiewende in German. Does it translate into all your languages? And what does it mean, Deborah, for example, in the US? Do we talk about the energy transition?
Yes, so the energy transition in the U.S. is very new. We went through a former paradigm shift after the 70s with the oil crises, and what was left in the American psyche was shortage, that there really wasn't going to be energy for the future, and we were going to have to get off of fossil fuels. And in the last, I would say, since about 2005, 2008, so it's very new, the U.S. is going through an entirely different energy transition now, and this cartoon somewhat encapsulates all of it. The doctor says, I'm afraid you have had a paradigm shift. The US doesn't really know what this means right now, and I think it's been very confusing. There are more questions than answers that we heard from Mr. Schmidt. It's very much true. We don't know if oil and gas are going to be truly abundant. A lot depends on the price. If the prices stay high, it probably will remain abundant. If the prices dip lower, these are expensive resources to gather. The Obama administration is all about all of the above. And last month was National Energy Awareness Month in the US. And what I fear is going on in the US right now is there's not really any structure for decision making. So it's yes to everything and no to nothing. So it's efficiency and it's oil and it's gas. We'll talk about nuclear later. But there's not much of a road, a path for us here. There's not much experience that the U.S. can follow in this newfound energy abundance.
Jim, in the news all the time, energy prices, but we don't talk too much in Britain about the energy transition, do we? Or is it a common theme?
No, the phrase energy transition is not commonly used in the UK, but there are actually 2 kinds of transition that we are speaking about. There's a transition that we've just gone through that's actually in the opposite direction from the US, because the UK was self-sufficient in oil and gas for a long time. North Sea reserves are now declining, and we're now moving to a position where the UK is a significant importer of both oil and gas. As that slide shows, that red bit shows the anxiety level that politicians have about the increasing reliance on imports. Looking forward, there is another kind of transition we need to think about. When we talk about a low-carbon transition rather than an energy transition, the UK has a very ambitious Climate Change Act which foresees 80% cuts in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. It's legally binding, and that low-carbon transition is really one of the major drivers for energy policy. But I think it's worthwhile saying that policy is in a really very fluid state at the moment, and it's going to be juggling three things: these long-term carbon ambitions, the fact on the ground of the changing balance of energy imports and exports, and finally the question of cost and affordability, which I think we'll come back to as a very important feature.
Absolutely. Tao Wang, my Chinese isn't sufficient to know. Well, I can say ni hao. But is there a Chinese equivalent of energy transition? Do they talk about it much?
Well, we have this energy transition idea for a long time, but Chinese government always wants something more ambitious and grand. So they are calling about to have an energy production and consumption revolution. And that actually, in simple words, is still to just reduce the reliance on coal. So everything else could be increased and just reduce the coal, because coal is already become such a heavy burden for China. And that relies to a few things. So you get more import from other resources, like the gas and oil, and also to promote renewables. And you can see the reason for that. First of all, it's they actually incurred the concern of energy security. China is actually importing more and more oil, and actually importing more oil than the United States. Now they were the largest importer of oil. And also in terms of percentage, higher than the United States. And half of them is coming from the Middle East. So Chinese government is very concerned about whether they will be able to have them forever, and where is the future energy sources coming from. And the second reason is using coal too much already causes huge pollution problems, and then cause a huge concern and public resistance to the situation. I see people actually doing exercise in the smog with the masks. So what's the point of having exercise and improving your health? So that's a huge pressure on Chinese government to do the transition of the energy to reduce the side effects of the environment. But at the same time, they also have undermining the other impact, because China is still looking for the growth of economy, so industry. So they're hoping that by leading and promoting that, they will be able to build up a strong industries for the future.
Thank you. Andreas, Löschel, Energiewende. Wende means the change, the transition. So it's a term, and it really means something for German people, the Energiewende.
Yeah, obviously. But I have to say that Energiewende is not a very new phenomenon. Now, in the 1990s, we had the fundamental decision by the German government to base the energy system more on renewables. In the years then, the feed-in tariff system in Germany increased over time. It got more broader, including other themes as well. And then in 2010, the government set up a long-term vision, the energy concept up to 2050, that wanted to draft an economically viable, environmental sound and socially accepted transition of the energy system. And then came Fukushima, which actually meant that we decided to step out of nuclear, but we kept more or less the other targets intact. And therefore we are now faced with a set of targets that span many different aspects, from greenhouse gas emissions to energy efficiency in transportation, in buildings, the share of renewables in energy and in electricity, and of course the phase out of nuclear power. I think the main question, as Jim already has mentioned, is what are the really important targets that we are aiming at, and what are just indicative goals. And from my reading, it's really about climate change in the end. So the commitment of the German government to reduce or greenhouse gas emissions by 80%, that's kind of the overarching target of this Energiewende. And then we have different targets that want to guide us in this process of increasing the share of renewables, of increasing energy efficiency. But it will be no stop of the energy transition if we don't achieve all these different targets I'm just mentioning here. It's a long-term process, and we are trying to find our way through.
Okay, well, I think we're now going to show you on the screen what the energy mix looks like in each of your countries, so that we can, we have the slide coming up any minute now, so that you can comment on it. We have the slide here anyway, energy mixes. Deborah, could you give us a comment?
Yeah, so the U.S., when you just take a quick look at the graphs, it looks like the U.S. is pretty balanced, but it's actually very fossil fuels heavy. About 3/4 are fossil fuels. And there are trends that are heading in the right direction. I mean, looking into the future, there is still a very big question mark. The biggest question I have is that the oil industry and all of the politicians didn't see shale gas and tight oil coming. So if even the industry doesn't see this new resource and the availability of it economically, it makes me question what the future really holds. So in this, there's a lot of uncertainty, but the Energy Information Administration pretty much is saying things won't change dramatically, even through 2040, but the right direction: oil shrinking slightly, gas growing slightly, coal shrinking, nuclear shrinking, and renewables growing. So those are generally good trends. But there are three major factors that underpin what will happen and why there is so much uncertainty. The first one is future oil prices. This graph always gets me, because the Energy Information Administration is basically forecasting from this moment forward, the price of oil, global price of oil, could be anywhere between $75 a barrel and $250 a barrel. And in that range, we really don't know the future. And that's going to be a huge issue here. There's more likely to be volatility. The curves won't look this smooth, so we're going to see a lot of fits and starts in the market. The second issue for the U.S. is that we entered, since the 70s, a huge shift toward energy efficiency and reduced energy demand. And the big question that I have is, looking at the future availability of U.S. oil and gas, will that push back on these efficiency trends, or will we continue down this sip the energy and export as much as we possibly can, which doesn't help the climate equation necessarily? And then the third trend on climate change is the U.S. is really not going to get where it needs to go. We went down recently on CO2, but every trend is pretty much hedging back up. So the U.S. is obviously not going to make its climate goals on efficiency alone. We're going to have climate policy, and the U.S. hasn't really had a cogent climate policy so far.
Okay, Andreas Löschel, a word perhaps on the energy mix in Germany.
Yes. If you look at the chart for the German energy mix, I mean, you can see that in terms of energy, we still rely a lot on oil as well as on coal and gas. So there is still a lot to do in the building sector as well as in the transportation sector. In most of these areas, the energy concept is very little developed in terms of the measures that we are taking. We think we have to take more in order to achieve as well the renewable targets in energy, which renewables now make in the energy mix in Germany about 11%. We are in better shape if you look at the electricity mix in Germany. There you can see in electricity, renewables now really play an important role. They contribute about 23% of electricity production. There we are actually in front of meeting our targets. We are above the linear expansion path of the renewables to achieve the 35% target in 2020, and then further targets along the road. What's as well interesting, I think, is that nuclear still plays an important role as well. I mean, we have phased out some nuclear capacity right after Fukushima, but there's still a long way to go. Next reactors will be phased out in 2015, and by 2022 we want to phase out the last one. So I would say a lot of the challenge is in front of us. And then the other thing you can see, natural gas plays a very small role. This is 2011 numbers. In 2012 it actually decreased. Now natural gas makes up only 12% of the electricity mix, and coal increased in the last year by 5%, now contributing about 45% to electricity generation. That obviously shows that there's not only the adding of renewables for reaching our targets, but it has to be as well framed by other policies to achieve our CO2 targets. CO2 emissions actually increased in Germany in the last year.
Okay, Jim, obviously the UK going in the other direction. Lots of headlines recently about Mr. Cameron wanting to reintroduce nuclear, which is the great saviour in the UK. What about our energy mix?
Well, the UK is in quite an interesting situation. I mean, the striking feature is that the non-fossil sources, nuclear and renewables, are still a very low percentage of the overall picture, about 10%, with a fair balance between coal, oil and gas for the remainder. The way that that is going to move in the immediate future, say to 2020, we're going to see a big expansion of renewable energy, a lot of investment in that taking place. And the other feature I think you will see is a move away from coal back towards gas in the electricity markets as our coal stations close as a result of environmental regulation. Looking to the long term, I think there are three big themes running through how the energy system in the UK might change under a low carbon transition. First of all is the decarbonisation of electricity, and there are some scenarios that say we could be virtually entirely reliant on low carbon by 2030, which is obviously a very big change. Second theme is the deployment of energy efficiency, which is obviously a very cost-effective solution in everyone's interest. And the interesting third theme, if you'd decarbonised electricity, it would make more sense to use electricity for purposes for which it has not been used previously. So moving towards battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid vehicles, for example, or switching from gas-fired boilers to electric heat pumps in buildings are all part of the low-carbon transition that's envisaged in the UK. And I indeed have colleagues in the electric utility sector who are starting to talk about the power station as the refinery of the future, because electricity could be used in multiple markets in a way that it hasn't been used before.
And Wang, we all think obviously lots of fossil fuels in China. Can you comment on the energy mix in your country?
Sure. If you look at the China's energy mix, the coal is still the king. It's taking about 70%, and the oil is 18% and increasing very fast. So this is a very interesting trend now you look at. Coal is not reducing that quickly, but at the same time, the oil is increasing so fast because the mobility is increasing. People are driving more and buying more cars. And also, because of the recent smogs and air pollutions, there are already some clear trend from the big cities and northern China that they are going to replace the coal with natural gas. So in the short term, you probably were able to see an increase, a surge even, of the natural gas in the China's mix. And that will make China wonder where they're going to get the gas, because gas is already becoming a more and more import-dependent resources. China only started importing natural gas from 2006, and now you can say it's actually more than 30% of the import is actually from the accounting for the gas consumptions. But if you look into the middle term and long term, China has several targets. For example, there is a target for China to have non-fossil fuel energy accounting for about 11.4% by 2015 and increase to 15% by 2020. So that is going to give a clear signal to the renewables and the nuclear. Nuclear, of course, had some hit back after the Fukushima, but it's actually recovering back. But in the long term, China has a long desire to reduce coal to a much lower level, not only because of the pollution, because the pollution is just recent thing, and they want to reduce the level and make the energy mix more looks like maybe America or European countries, where you get maybe a third from gas, a third from oil, or maybe an even larger share from renewables, and coal probably only down to about 20 or 30%. But this is still very, very challenging for China to see that happen.
Okay, so we've had a general view, an overview of your different energy mixes. I'd like now to ask you which you consider to be the main challenges in your countries, and what means your different governments can put into motion in order to meet these challenges. Jim?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would actually start with the political process as one of the biggest challenges in the UK, because there are two sort of threads in the political debate at the moment in the UK. One saying that we should run a much more laissez-faire kind of energy policy, which would imply a big reliance on natural gas, and the other one which says we should stick to these very high level of ambitions for the carbon budgets. We have a unique system of 5-year carbon budgets that go up to 15 years into the future, as this slide shows. And the fourth carbon budget, which runs from 2023 to 2027, is ambitious, and it's to be reviewed by the government early next year. And clearly the laissez-faire tendency would like to see that budget slackened. The Committee on Climate Change, which I'm sitting on, is already broadcasting what its advice on this will be, which the budget should not be loosened, and you know, there are strong cases for doing that. So this political debate, I think, is a big challenge. I think the other challenge is the question of public acceptance and buy-in to this whole agenda. We're probably going to come on to it, but the politics of the affordability of energy are really quite crucial.
It's really in the news at the moment. All the headlines in the British paper.
It is the top issue in the UK. I mean, we can perhaps get onto this, but it is a very, very divisive issue, and it also turns down to the reputation of energy companies at the moment as well, who've probably slipped in the public view somewhere below bankers in terms of public esteem. So this is a really big challenge. There are also longer-term challenges about the acceptability of new technologies that might drive a low-carbon transition. Will people be prepared to buy electric vehicles? Do they want to switch from gas-fired boilers to heat pumps in their homes? There's these longer-term technical acceptance issues as well.
Deborah, as so often, the situation is very different in the States.
Yeah, so the states, going back to my opening remarks, are really caught between this very big change from scarcity to abundance and what that means to America economically, politically, and just socially. So we're really in a puzzle, which is what this slide is supposed to represent, where every actor seems to have a different perspective right now, and there's no cohesion on the American side. To take off where Jim just left off on the public side, the real question is a lot of confusion. And will this abundance mean lower prices at the pump? And the answer really is no. And no politician and no private sector will tell them we will have abundance at high prices. But these resources are too expensive to get if the prices are cheap. So abundance is supposed to mean cheap, but it won't mean necessarily cheap. And then you have government, very much depending on if they're local or if they're national. There are a lot of different aspects. If you're a North Dakota senator, you're very excited and bullish on the shale and the Balkan, but it's very different if you're in New York or another place, and the national elected officials are very excited about trade and other issues. So there's a lot of confusion politically. Environmentalists have mounting concerns. I don't think most of the environmental community realizes that we've exited scarcity into potential abundance. So they're kind of still touting the 1970s mantra, which is even more confusing. And then, of course, you have industry and trade partners. And I think that there's a sense of this is an economic savior, but it's not really clear if it could be managed.
Okay, Andreas, Löschel, I appreciate you have a problem at the moment. You don't have a government. It's still trying to be formed. But look into your crystal ball. What are the challenges and how can they be met?
Well, I think we already see from the negotiations for the new government what are the things that are going to be tackled quickly. The one thing, of course, is the reform of our renewable support scheme. In the past, we had a very effective scheme, which was, by definition, not so much looking at economic efficiency. And I think that is going to change gradually. So we are going to try to get the cheaper sources of renewables into our systems. We have to integrate them better. At the moment, feed-in tariffs, they don't take into account the demand situation, whether electricity is really demanded or not, so we have to bring them into the market. And then the feed-in tariff system as well do not really look at local issues of grid development. We have a lot of the load in the south, a lot of the renewables in the north, so we really have to think about how we can speed up the grid development. And last, how can we have the prices, the electricity prices, at an acceptable level. That is, of course, linked to this efficiency issue that all has to be tackled by the next government. It has to be tackled relatively quickly because these problems have been building up in the last 2 years before we had the election, and now we have to solve these problems.
Okay, and I think in China you have 2020 objectives, a bit like in Europe.
Yes, I think in China, actually, the government is trying very hard to set the targets and then pushing that. But I think what is most important for them to make this transition happen is actually to change the way actually government direct the resources. And just at the recent third plenum of the 18th Congress of the CCP, they are actually laying down the reform maps that in the future they're going to do less national targets things, giving you orders and command, but actually by focusing on creating the market and allows the resources to be flowing more efficiently to the places who are generating the resources. So I think this is the big challenge for them. And the government will have to change the way they're operating, but it's not so easy. And at the same time, there is also a concern of public perceptions, because Chinese people are still poor. Even in the big cities like Beijing, the middle class is still struggling with the rising cost, living cost, everything. So they're very, very sensitive about the price increase, particularly like the oil, the gas increase, the water increase, electricity increase. But the main problem in China is actually the underprice of most of the resources. It's only because the coal is too cheap that we use that much. And also because the natural gas is so cheap that the national oil and gas companies have no interest to developing them. So we are actually not using that much of gas. So in the future, we are bound to have more price increase in the resources, and people have to be more careful about their usage. I think this is also something very, very difficult because people are struggling with these ideas of they have to pay more for the welfares and they're already having. So I think this is something they have to do. But at the same time, China is also need to improve the kind of coordination of the policies and institutions, because there are some good policies that the Chinese government already developed, but they are not really implemented very well because of the lack of coordination, and the different institutions have different interests. And this is also something I think as a major task of this reform in this third plenum. They have to tackle this down and make a more coordinated and comprehensive decisions in the future.
Okay, we just had a rather French caricature. I'll explain it to you after the thing. There are now two big questions. If we get down to the heart of the matter, is nuclear and shale gas, where we obviously have a wide range of opinions. Let's start with you, Andreas. With nuclear, obviously Germany has a very interesting point of view. I used to live in Berlin. I know that most Germans are anti-nuclear, and it's different from here and in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, on both issues, nuclear and shale gas, I think the Germans have very bold opinions. Refusing nuclear, I mean, that was really something that we had already since 2002, actually, as well in law. Nobody really took it very serious at the starting, but now after Fukushima, the reiteration of these phase-out targets by the Christian Democrat liberal government, of course, seems to be now really a strong dedication. It's a bilaterally supported target, so I'm sure that we will see the phase-out of nuclear. It's, as you said, supported by the German constituency, so this will come for sure.
Okay, Jim, as I say, the UK, as often, going the other way.
Yeah, an interesting situation, I think, in the UK. Both the coalition government and the opposition are supportive of investment in new nuclear power stations in the UK. There's a bill going through Parliament at the moment that will institute a major reform of electricity markets, and that will help to provide guaranteed prices for low-carbon power, including nuclear. So that's the kind of the formula for how it works up there. Feed-in tariffs through contracts for differences. It's technically described as. Now, nuclear particularly, it's worthwhile saying that there are no real public acceptability obstacles to nuclear in the UK. All the public opinion polling shows that people are not enthusiastic about nuclear, but they will accept it in the context of issues like climate change and energy security. Any new nuclear power stations would be built on existing sites, and the communities tend to be supportive of new investment because they're mindful of the economic benefits rather than the other risk factors. The big challenge for nuclear in the UK is the business case and the support for it, because the government has almost concluded a deal with EDF over a first new reactor, and the strike price that's shown up there is not about the £70 per megawatt hour. There it's actually about 90, which is almost double the current wholesale price. And this is causing big challenges for the government because it's thinking about affordability concerns for consumers, and equally the companies who need to think about risky investment investments. It still takes a long time. There are a lot of risks associated with building a nuclear plant in Europe. So the ambition is there. I think we wait to see what happens.
Deborah, you get the feeling that in the US, nuclear issues aren't particularly transformational. Is it because people are not really aware of it very much, or they don't expect much from it? It's not such an issue, is it?
Well, I would say the nuclear power sector is going through the biggest transformation of any energy right now, directly because of shale gas, actually. This is the curve of, for the first time ever in our nuclear history, we're looking at shutdowns, not expanding plants, and a reduction in nuclear power, which is really a transformation for the US. The big question is whether we'll export LNG. If we're going to export LNG and the prices go up, there is competition hanging in the wings with coal, nuclear, and natural gas in the power sector. So this could easily head right back up. And the Energy Information Administration basically says in its forecasts that between now and 2040, nuclear stays the same. So it's not going to necessarily grow, but depending on what we do with gas, it could shrink.
And in China, it's the big story, nuclear.
It is a very big story, and I think probably our French friends probably have more emotional experience than I do for the Chinese nuclear industries, because for quite a long history that the nuclear power is actually from France to China and helping establishing the nuclear power industries from the very beginning. And now the third generations of the nuclear power plants in China, after all the ups and downs, now it goes to Westinghouses instead of Areva. So I think this is a new technology directions that China is trying to do, but there are still open options for both. And in general speaking, China has very big hope, expectations on nuclear. And you can see that the chart before even though China only have very low capacity as of 2010, but the plan is very high. It goes to anywhere between 40 gigawatts to 90 or 80 gigawatts by 2020, so it's adding very quickly. And it's even higher, some people talking about 100 gigawatts. But then what happens in Fukushima is actually China become much more cautious about the targets, and they actually held down some of the plan and cut back the ambition. But now they realized, as I said before, China has this international commitment to have non-fossil fuel energy consumption by 11.4% or 15%, and they realize it's not possible or very, very difficult without nuclear in this equation. So the nuclear industries after this is trying to advocating to revive these targets, and they are going to probably push more for Chinese government to build and even more of these targets in the future. But there is also something very interesting happening in China. Just this year, there is a huge protest in southeast China. It's a rich areas, and people are protesting against a uranium processing plant because they worry about the environmental impact, and they don't trust the local government and the state-owned enterprises that they are going to take the most stringent standards of processing. So they worry they will be subject to leakage or risk of the health. So actually, at the end, they win, and the government just canceled the plants, and the loss to the local government and the state-owned enterprise was huge because they done plans for years, and then just one night they've been canceled. So this may be a new trend, whether the nuclear is still going to enjoy the undisrupted welcome to the local government in the future, or it's going to subject to more resistance from the local public. It's an open question to see.
Okay, apart from nuclear, the other sexy question in at the moment about energy is shale gas, the US.
So shale gas is truly, along with tight oil, the revolution going on here. It was in the works since the 1980s, but the prices actually got high enough to bring that technology to the market. What's interesting about the tight oil and the shale gas is it's starting in America, but if you look at where it is in the world, America has about 15% of the known reserves. So we're talking the vast majority is in the rest of the world. This is a technology that's going to transfer, and so the big question is going to be how we learn, and I think the US is responsible to teach and learn how we're going to manage shale gas and tight oil, because they're very different resources with very different impacts.
Shale gas in China it's still an unfolding story, isn't it?
It is an unfolding story, and the government has very high expectations. China already had 3 rounds of the bidding of the shale gas exploration, and the first round is only open to the state-owned enterprises, state-owned oil and gas enterprises. And second round, they actually opened it up and successfully kind of like lured into some of the private sectors, and people doing steels or doing real estate also interested in this. But afterwards, they found out their rigs are not generating much gases. So the third round is probably more cautious. I think in China, there is a large reserve probably, but the difficulty is also very clear. The lack of water resources, and also the buried much deeper than the US cases, which means you need to use more sophisticated technologies. And also those areas are population, very dense areas. So it's much more difficult for China to actually have the same kind of shale gas explorations and large scale very quickly. So I think people are now becoming more realistic about it and say whether they can do it. But as a government, they still hope they can actually benefit from the shale gas revolution anyway.
I live in France, but I watch Sky News all the time. Shale gas was practically the major issue over the summer, with lots of demonstrations and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, then this position in the UK is interesting because there are shale gas resources under the UK. The big question is whether they can be turned into economic reserves. And there are differences between the UK and the US. The geological conditions are different. The legal framework for ownership of the resource is different. And I think there are really big concerns about sort of the environmental dimensions as well. So looking where we are going forward, I think one of the trickiest things is when God decided to put shale gas resources under the UK, he decided to test the body politic by putting it under some of the wealthiest and leafiest parts of the UK. And this will be a major challenge going forward and has led to the remarks you made, Alex, about the demonstrations over the summer at Balcombe in Sussex, where a unique coalition of environmental activists and wealthy commuters, sort of parked themselves in front of the trucks to try and prevent the shale gas drilling actually taking place. So I think the sober assessment of shale gas in the UK, it may make some contribution, but it is not the revolutionary game changer that that we saw in the United States.
Let's talk about renewables now. Obviously, they're moving fast with you in China.
Well, China is doing a lot. I mean, as I just described, they are trying to promoting everything but coal. So renewable is actually increasing fast. If you look at this chart, China is actually, they were #1 in terms of the renewable energy capacity. And remind you, this is not including hydro as well. Hydro is absolutely even more within China. So basically, they are doing very much to pushing for the renewables. The target is also very ambitious. The wind, the latest target for the 2015 is actually more than 100 gigawatt. China is already the world's largest wind power installations and also producer. And they are trying to consolidate this position. And even for the solar PV, which we are very aware of this the trade dispute between US, China, and also the China-EU. The side effect is actually China opens up a very big domestic market for the PV. So they actually raise up the targets of the solar PV in China from something very beginning at 5 gigawatts by 2015 to now 35 gigawatts 2015. So the same year, they changed so much, and they actually reveal the big potential of that. They are actually trying to push for that. I think the solar PV industry is currently very struggling, and they are reshuffling, and also there are a lot of bankruptcies and debt. But after they recover from this, there's going to be a new wave of development.
Obviously, renewables start from quite a small base in the US. Where are we now?
So yeah, renewables are off a very small base. I think they're expected to grow by leaps and bounds, actually. Ironically, forced by regulations, but that's how the US, it's not as market-oriented as other countries are. It tends to be more regulatory. But depending on if we export shale gas again, it won't just be coal and nuclear that are buoyed. It could be renewables as well, because as the price of oil and gas go up, it makes these renewables more economic. So I think that they're going to enter into more of a market economy, which will only help them rise.
A low base also in the UK for renewables to start from.
Yeah, we started from a very low base in the UK, but the big driver has been the EU Renewable Energy Directive, which is taking us towards, say, about 30% of electricity coming from renewables by 2020. You can see from that graph how just rapidly things are taking off. I mean, I think beyond 2020, the situation is really quite open because if we set a strict decarbonisation target for 2030, where the EU 2030 process matters a lot, then there could be continued investment throughout the 2020s. If not, then the investment could dry up unless there are very clear signals for the investment to take place. Now, one thing I think should flag about renewables is the choice of technologies. You can see that there's a lot of bioenergy, which essentially consists of power plants burning Canadian wood chips at ports in the UK. Interesting way of doing renewables. And there has been a bit of a pushback against onshore wind turbines because of public acceptability concerns. And that has really driven the drive in the UK to move offshore in terms of wind technology, which is obviously more expensive, more demanding conditions. But that is where I think you might expect the bulk of the expansion to take place. We have a wonderful asset in the North Sea, which we use for all sorts of purposes.
The Mail Online is the most visited newspaper website in the world, so if they're against wind turbines, it's probably not good news for it. A different situation totally with renewables in Germany.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the German numbers, you can see that in the last years, of course, the investments in renewables were really large. So our installed capacity more than tripled in the last 8 years, from 20 gigawatt to more than 70 gigawatt in Germany. Actually, on the right-hand side of these graphs, you can see where this investment actually took place in wind and in solar. You can as well see that solar actually just last year overtook wind, as the most important renewable source in Germany. And you can see here that wind is specifically invested in the north of Germany, solar specifically in the south. That as well shows that the German lenders have very different interests in these technologies. I've not shown offshore wind, which will be one of the main topics in the future in the North and the East Sea, the Baltic Sea. So this will come in the future. At the moment, you see that the lender have very strong interest in these developments. We have an official redistribution scheme between the lender, but the feed-in tariff system in Germany now redistributes more money than these official schemes. So this is something that really as well is important to figure in when we talk about future developments. The numbers that you see here will continue, but probably at a lower pace.
But one of the surprising things, Andreas, about Germany is that the downside of this is the increased use of coal. How can you explain that? Suddenly coal's gone back up again in Germany.
Yeah, that's really an important thing to look at. I think there are several issues that we have to figure in here. The one, of course, is the prices of coal are relatively competitive, compared to gas. So that's totally independent of our energy transformation. The other thing is the emission trading system in Europe only has very low prices. That as well is to some extent independent of the German development. But for the German government, one thing is that we have to really work on the European targets. I mean, we are now in the process of setting new targets for 2030. And if we are serious with these targets in Germany, we really have to make sure that the European targets are really tough, and they are then as well bringing others into the play. Otherwise, the emission trading system will just reshuffle emissions from one member state to the other, and that will not help the German development.
Tao, what about coal in China? What's going to happen in the future?
Well, consumption side, I think is still going to increase, but probably in the future increase slower. But in the production side, that is a very different picture. The Chinese coal industry is stumbling at the moment. They are facing all sorts of difficulties. First of all, is the economy is slowing down, and also there is a slowing down, particularly in the heavy industries, which also further depress the demand. So the price of coal actually drops almost a third within a year, and most of the coal minings are actually making a huge deficit and actually crying for the government to save them. And at the same time, there is also increasing competition of the importing coal from Australia, from even Russia, Mongolia, Colombia, and even probably coming from U.S. That's partly because the shipping cost is so cheap to ship a ton of the coal from U.S. to China is probably only a third or even less than the price and shipping their coal or transporting the coal by train or by trucks from Western China to the Eastern China. So then actually making people more willing to buy coals with higher quality at lower prices from importing. And then that will make a huge problem to the coal industries, and they are now trying to protect themselves by lobbying the central government, by lobbying the local government. But I think increasingly, also because of pollutions, the people are actually very, very unpopular in terms of the preference to the coal. So they are going to have a big problems in the future, and they have to reshuffle.
Okay, well, while we have you here, Tao, it's obviously important. The U.S.-China Climate Change Working Group, which was set up by Barack Obama and Xi Jinping in June 2013, is this for you a potential game changer? Where do we stand?
I wouldn't say this is a game changer, but this is certainly something very significant between US and China. I think this is something they use as one of those as measures to demonstrate what President Xi Jinping just called the new type of major nations relationship between US and China. And they are looking for the things that they will be able to move between these two countries, for example, HFC demolition and also heavy-duty trucks. And they are already pushing forward this type of collaborations. But so far, I think it's still, as most of the national initiatives, they are lacking of the back from the business. So the government is talking a lot, but then the progress on ground is still yet to be seen.
China, US?
So on the U.S. side, the bilateral approach is obviously welcomed. It's been in the works at the national lab level and deeper in the government with research for a long time. But these are very long-term issues, and the things that China and the U.S. are talking about are technologies that are going to need a heavy lift for a very long time. But then you have short-term issues like this graph that shows that the U.S., because of the Great Recession recently that we went through, has seen a huge decrease in its, or compared to the increase in China. So China's at the top, U.S. is at the bottom. It's things like this that could really slow down a bilateral agreement on things like heavy-duty trucks and CCS. I mean, these are very long-term, difficult issues that I hope that the two countries continue to work together on.
Okay, we're talking about energy transition. One thing we haven't covered is the cost of all this. I think you're the best person to talk about this. You have the Energiewende. It's going to be a big pull on German growth. It's costing a lot, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's costing a lot, and that was as well the main discussion we had in front of the election. Many people look at the feed-in tariffs, and they see the increase in feed-in tariffs over time from 0.2 cent to 3.5 cent to 5.2 cent last year, and next year to 6.2. So this is seen as a stark increase. We tried in the monitoring commission to put this on a little bit broader basis, and that is the figure you can see on the upper left side, the total electricity cost for final consumers. And there you see that the final consumers spent around 40 billion for electricity in 1991. With liberalization that went down a little bit to 35, and since then it's steadily increased, and in 2011 we paid about 64 billion euro for electricity in Germany. So this is the one possibility to look at the numbers. The other one is you can compare that to our GDP. And if you do that, you get another interesting insight. In 1991, the share of GDP that we invest or that we spent on electricity was 2.5%. And in 2011, it was as well 2.5%. So we spent exactly the same amount of GDP on electricity in 1991 and 2011. So if you ask me, can we afford it? I would say yes, we can afford it. But you see that this increase was really steep in the last years, and there are a lot of things in front of us concerning new renewables, storage, conventional power plants, so grid development. So we see these costs are going to increase in the future, so we really have to look for that. Another point I would like to make is the distribution of costs. We very often talk about the household sector. That's on the upper right side. You see that here taxes actually made a large part of the costs for households, and they increased very much. And you see the same picture on the lower left side for the commercial sector, for the service sector. So they as well pay a lot. On the lower right side, you see the average electricity price for the energy-intensive industry, and that as well increased quite considerably. But in the last 2 years, that actually dropped because of this drop in wholesale markets. We flooded the wholesale market with renewables, which as well led to a drop in the prices. And the larger energy-intensive industries, they profited from this development. So I think it's not only about the size. Well, I think we can afford at the moment, we have to curb in the future, but it's as well about the distribution, which is seen as unfair by many people in Germany.
So the Germans can more or less afford it. What about the British?
Well, I think it's not a question of whether you can afford, but whether you're willing to afford is the key issue. Electricity and gas prices for households have risen hugely in recent years, and the topic has now become the #1 political issue, full stop, not just in the energy sphere. Now, if you look at the reasons underlying it, most of it is attributable to the underlying rises in the price of wholesale gas. But there's now a political blame game running, with some people attributing it to green levies and charges, other people attributing it to profiteering by the utility companies. So it's a very toxic kind of political environment at the moment. The leader of the opposition raised the temperature at the end of the summer by saying that if coming into the government, they would freeze electricity prices for 18 months after the election. And what was once a cross-party consensus on energy has now kind of evaporated. And that is having implications, for the investment climate in the UK as well, with companies a bit reluctant to invest. It's a bit difficult to see where it's actually going, but we certainly don't have that cross-party consensus anymore, and it is a hot topic.
I would say it was the hottest topic in British politics at the moment, energy prices, since Ed Miliband did that. And Tao, what would you say about China? Would you be able to afford this?
I think it's a different question. In fact, China cannot afford the price of not transiting the energy system. It's already so high in terms of the social cost, and also because of the industry is so distorted towards the heavy industry, so they have to change. And in fact, the government is already liberalized the coal market, the price already increasing like rocket last few years and now drops. And they are also slowly opening up the price of oil. So the oil price, after 2 or 3 years of the regulations from the NDRC, they are going to be much more liberalized, and you can actually calculate yourself from the point market, from international market oil prices. And the next step is actually, because coal prices already being liberalized, they are going to have to also to liberalize and make more flexible mechanism of the electricity price, because that is a major contribution of the electricity. And you cannot allow the electricity, producers will not be able to pass the price to the customers. But that is very difficult. The next one is the gas. As China becoming a new gas players, because we use more and more gas, this cost associated with importing gas is not well considered by the government. So that also will have to impact on that. But I think this is an inevitable trend, and people have to digest. People will be worrying about this, but we also have to pay higher price if we don't do that. So this is something I think is a hard decision we have to make.
Okay, I want to ask the last question to you, Andreas, because 3 years ago the Energiewende, the transition, was launched. I think it'd be very interesting for you to conclude this roundtable before I come to questions. What are the lessons to be drawn from your experience already?
Well, from my point of view, I think what we learned from the first 3 years, first is that in terms of the priorities, we focus a lot on the electricity sector, but we do neglect to a large extent transport and buildings. I think that is something that has to be fixed relatively quick, because otherwise, this whole thing will obviously not work. I think as well we do pay not enough attention to Europe. That is not only for the climate targets, it's as well for the renewable targets, it's for the grid development, it's as well for the sensible use of conventional power plants, which as well are all much easier in the European context, and this was as well neglected by the policymakers so far. I already showed you these different targets. I think their policy has to really decide what are the important ones. Is it problematic for the energy transition if we don't achieve our target for electric vehicles? I would say no. Is it important to achieve our targets for offshore wind? I would say probably not. No, but there are some targets that you really have to achieve, and policy has to make a decision there, and they don't want to do that, no, because there's so much things at stake at the moment and so much pressure from different interest groups in these different areas that policies was not able to really commit to some of these overarching targets. And then we already talked about the new design for the feed-in tariff system. That is something that's going to come. It's probably will be looking similar to the UK model that we have just seen. That will be an important step forward. We have to see that grid development is accelerating, but there it's really a problem of acceptability. And you rightly said is something, are we actually willing to afford the money? Are we willing to see the infrastructures investment going in place? So it's really that this is what we call ein Gemeinschaftsprojekt. So it's a common project. No, and if this is not seen as a common project, it will not fly. If it's only seen as something where we redistribute money and give money to all these different aspects, then it cannot succeed.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm sure we're going out live at the moment. I'm sure there are a few tweets, and then I'll come to the floor for a few questions. So we're rather pushed for time. So are we really looking for low carbon energy or cheap energy in the current economic context? Is that something that's actually feasible? Who'd like to take this one? Deborah.
I guess I can say that a really big question that the U.S. hasn't addressed in this newfound energy abundance with oil, gas, and certainly sending coal to China is that the U.S. is going to build up itself economically based on exporting carbon. And there's going to be a huge question in terms of climate change of what that means to hand off all of this carbon. And it goes to the question here, a low carbon energy is not really the way that the U.S. is looking right now.
Okay, anybody else want to comment on that tweet? Are we really? Yeah, Jim.
I mean, I think the perspective would be the public would really like to have it all, as it were, low carbon and low prices. I don't think that's a choice that we really face. I think one of the unfortunate things is when we've talked about the cost of decarbonisation, we've often talked it will be less than 1% of GDP because it doesn't matter. But when that 1% of GDP flows through people's electricity bills, their utility bills, it becomes very, very visible. And I think that is the big challenge that we have. If we want to go low carbon, we need to pay more for our energy, and that's just a fact of life.
Yes, I have a question here from Total, Gérard Moutet. You have been showing us very different way of energy transition in your country in terms of motivation, in terms of result, etc. But if I try to link with the previous session, there is, or at least there should be, a certain need in the medium term to have a certain currency between your different country policy and the global goal. Mr. Lamy was talking about globalization and its importance. Mr. Jouzel of carbon budget. So my question is, how this necessity, or what should be a necessity of coherency between the individual country goal and the global goal is discussed in your country? And to be more specific, maybe it's a too wide question, this has to be explained to the people, to the voters, to the citizens. Who is the most credible in your different country to speak about this question? Is it the scientists? Is it the press? Is it the ONG? Is it the business enterprise? Is it the government? Who can explain in a simple and credible way what are the questions? Thank you.
Vast question, but I think he's hit the nail on the head, isn't it? Why are we've all had different examples here. Why are we not working more together? And who should be pushing for this? Who would like to take that one on? Andreas, to start with.
Well, I already said that the German government, for example, was more or less silent on the European debate for new energy and climate policies. I mean, that can be to some extent explained by the election, but I mean, that has to change dramatically now and very soon, because I think what you just mentioned is very important, and it can be solved on the European scale by a joint vision on the energy and climate goals until 2030. And as well on the global level, I think Germany has not played really an active role in the past. We should do that now, because I think with the Durban platform we have, I think, a new start in international climate policy which is worthwhile to support in order to really achieve some targets there.
Jim?
Yeah, I mean, First of all, at the European level, I think there's a big concern in Brussels now about what they're calling the renationalisation of energy policy, because countries are getting impatient with what they see as the failure of the EU emission trading scheme. There's much more a trend to go it alone. And I have to say that Germany and the UK are probably sitting together as the biggest culprits in terms of that, with our quite unique approaches to energy policy. Just to go to the global level, I mean, this question of a common currency, as it were, I think, having a carbon price is really a completely necessary condition for moving forward. It is worthwhile saying some work that we did on the UK Committee on Climate Change shows that something like 20% of global emissions are now covered by some kind of emission trading scheme, whether it's in China, which is emerging, or individual states within the US. That's actually quite a remarkable development and something that ought to be built on, I think, if we're going to move forward.
Okay, I'll take another question now from the floor.
Yes, Philip Albrecht from Total. It is a question for Professor Löschel. In Germany, the electricity producer built a lot of new gas power plants with very efficiency. We filled, for instance, for 60% for gas steam turbine versus nuclear plant for 33%. This brand new gas plant are running a few hours in a year. Why? It's bad forecasting, bad time schedule, too early, too late, mistake in the subsidizing policy.
Well, I think it's a bit of all, no? I mean, at the moment, really in the south, I mean, some of these gas power plants, they run 50 or 60 hours per year. No, it's clear that this is not going to be economic in the way forward. On the other hand, we think that this is a very important technology to support the renewables. So therefore, I think that is something policymakers have to address. I think they really have to show the value of these gas power plants as well economically, which would mean integrating the renewables, for example, in the market. Would probably help us to increase a bit the market prices. We should as well provide some more incentive for this type of power plants. And I think that is something that is going to be discussed with the government relatively soon. At the moment, we don't have really an economic problem, because we have a lot of conventional capacity in Germany. So we have not a problem of shortages, for example, to worry about that. But we have a problem in the longer run, in the end of the 1910 years, around 2020, around 2020, we will see that we as well run into physical shortages. And therefore, we have to think about a policy. But this policy has to be broader. It cannot only be a German policy. It has to be integrated in the European vision. Otherwise, it will as well be not well economic.
Okay, well, I'm sure there's lots of other fascinating questions, but I do want to keep us on time because we've got a very, very intense day. I'd like you to give a big round of applause to a fascinating round table about different international approaches.